There's a certain kind of quiet that only exists when you're alone in the house. I'm not talking about the usual nighttime silence, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. No, I mean the kind of quiet that feels too still, too perfect, like the house is waiting for something. That was the kind of quiet I experienced that night. My parents were out of town, and I had the house to myself for the weekend. I was looking forward to a peaceful evening, just me, some movies, and maybe a late-night snack right in the kitchen. Nothing out of the ordinary. I wasn't one to scare easily. Growing up an only child, I was used to being home alone, and my house had never given me a reason to be afraid. Until that night. It started around 10:30 p.m. I was in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, when I heard a soft thump from upstairs. It was faint, almost like a book falling off a shelf. I paused for a moment, listening, but when nothing else followed, I shrugged it off. Houses make noises, especially old ones like mine. I returned to my movie, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something was slightly off. About half an hour later, I heard another sound, this time louder, a distinct creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I muted the TV and sat still, straining to hear. The house was quiet again, but that feeling of numbness settled in my chest, trying to shake it off. I grabbed my phone and texted a friend, half joking about how I was creeping myself out being home alone. She laughed it off, reminding me that I'd been through this a million times before. That gave me a little comfort, and I decided to head to the kitchen for some water, hoping the movement would ease my nerves. As I walked into the hallway, I felt the air shift like a faint breeze that didn't belong in an enclosed space. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I froze in place, listening intently. That's when I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from upstairs. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or some distant noise from outside, but deep down, I knew better. The whisper was coming from my house. Every instinct told me not to go upstairs, but I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy metal flashlight, and cautiously made my way up the stairs. Each step felt agonizingly slow. The house seemed to hold its breath with me, the silence thick and oppressive. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stood still, my ears straining for any sign of movement. That's when I heard the whisper again, clearer this time, like words I couldn't quite make out. It was coming from my bedroom. I swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight tightly as I inched toward the door. The whisper stopped as soon as I reached the threshold. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hand trembled as I slowly pushed the door open. My room was exactly as I had left it, nothing out of place, no signs of intrusion. The window was closed, the curtains still. But there was an undeniable chill in the air, a coldness that seemed to seep into my bones. I stepped inside, scanning the room with my flashlight, but saw nothing unusual. I was about to leave when something caught my eye, a faint reflection in the mirror above my dresser. I turned to face it, and my breath caught in my throat. There was a figure standing just behind me, a shadowy silhouette that wasn't there a moment before. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. I didn't wait to find out more. I bolted downstairs, my heart racing. I locked myself in the living room, turning on every light I could find. The whispering didn't return, and the house seemed to settle back into its normal stillness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed up the rest of the night, unable to sleep, jumping at every creak and groan the house made. When morning finally came, the oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and everything felt normal again. But I couldn't forget what I'd seen or what I'd heard. I never told anyone the full story, partly because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. But I knew what I experienced that night was real. I never felt truly alone in that house again, and though nothing ever happened like that again, the memory of that whispering presence still haunts me. Some places hold onto things, memories, energies, whatever you want to call them. I don't know what was in my house that night, but it was real, and it was there. And though I came out of it unharmed, the fear has never quite left me. It was an unusually quiet evening when my parents left for their weekend getaway, leaving me home alone for the first time. I was excited about the solitude, and had planned a night of gaming and movies. The house was large, a charming but old structure with creaky floors and drafty rooms, and I had always found its age part of its charm. The first few hours were perfect. I settled into my routine, playing video games and enjoying the peace. As the night deepened, the house grew eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. I didn't think much of it. The house had always been a bit noisy. Around midnight, I decided to make some popcorn and watch a horror movie. I moved through the darkened kitchen, the only light coming from the dim glow of the microwave. As the popcorn popped, I heard a strange noise, soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone was knocking on the front door. I froze. My parents were gone, and the sound seemed out of place. I peered through the kitchen window but saw nothing. The tapping continued intermittently, and a shiver ran down my spine. I checked the front door and saw that it was locked and secure. I told myself it was probably just the wind. I returned to the living room, trying to shake off the unease. The tapping stopped, and soon after, I heard another sound, a faint scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. My heart began to race. I turned up the volume on the TV, trying to drown out the noise, but the scraping grew louder. I decided to investigate. I walked through the house, flipping on lights as I went, but found nothing amiss. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I checked each room carefully, reassuring myself that there were no intruders. When I reached the attic stairs, the scraping sound seemed to come from there. The attic was a place I avoided, a dark, dusty space filled with old furniture and boxes. I hesitated but knew I had to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up the narrow stairs. The attic door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, revealing a small, cluttered space. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating old trunks, unused furniture, and piles of newspapers. The scraping noise had stopped. I scanned the room but saw nothing unusual. The attic was empty, save for the old belongings. Just as I was about to turn around, I heard it again, the tapping noise, this time coming from directly behind me. I whipped around, the beam of the flashlight revealing nothing but dust and cobwebs. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving me in a silence that was almost more frightening than the noise. I decided I had enough. I went back downstairs, locking the attic door behind me and securing the house. I tried to return to my movie, but every creak of the house seemed amplified, every shadow more menacing. The night dragged on, and despite my best efforts, sleep eluded me. Finally, just before dawn, I heard the tapping again, this time at the bedroom door. I was too scared to get up, so I lay in bed, holding my breath. The tapping persisted for a few minutes, then suddenly stopped. Exhausted, I must have fallen asleep, as I woke up to the sunlight streaming through my window. When my parents returned later that day, I told them about the noises, but they dismissed it as imagination or perhaps an old house settling. I checked the attic one more time with my dad, but it was just as I had left it, empty and dusty. To this day, I can't explain the noises I heard that night. The house felt different after that experience, as if something had been awakened. My parents continue to insist it was just the house settling, but every time I'm home alone now, I can't help but listen for that faint, rhythmic tapping, always wondering if there's something or someone lurking in the shadows. Last summer, I had the house to myself for a few days while my parents were away on a trip. It was supposed to be a relaxing break, but what started as a routine few days alone turned into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. The house was quiet, a little too quiet, but I enjoyed the solitude. I spent the first evening catching up on some reading and watching movies, the usual way I spent my free time. By the second night, the silence began to feel oppressive. I'd heard about the house creaking and settling, but the noises that night were different, more rhythmic and deliberate. It started with soft, deliberate knocks that seemed to come from various places around the house. I initially thought it was just the house settling, but as the night progressed, the noises became more frequent and more distinct. They sounded like footsteps walking across the hardwood floors upstairs, where my parents' bedroom was. I knew I was alone, so the idea of someone else being in the house was absurd and frightening. Around midnight, the noise was joined by an eerie scratching sound from the attic. The attic was accessible through a pull-down ladder in the hallway. I had never really gone up there because it was always full of old boxes and forgotten furniture. My curiosity was piqued, but so was my fear. I decided to investigate, hoping to dismiss the noises as nothing more than the house settling or animals in the attic. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands trembling slightly as I pulled down the ladder. The attic entrance creaked open, revealing a dark, musty space. I shone the flashlight up into the attic, trying to pierce the darkness. The attic was filled with dust-covered furniture and old trunks. The scratching sound had stopped, but I felt an eerie presence, like I was being watched. I checked around, but the space seemed empty except for the usual clutter. The flashlight illuminated old, cobweb-covered items, an old rocking chair, some faded portraits, and a large trunk in the corner. I moved the flashlight to the trunk, and that's when I saw the shadow moving just outside the beam of light. I swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. My heart was racing. I stood still for a moment, trying to calm myself, but the oppressive silence made my skin crawl. I decided it was best to retreat downstairs. As I climbed back down, the ladder creaked, and the scratching sound started again, louder this time, coming from right above me. I quickly pulled the ladder up and closed the attic entrance, trying to convince myself it was just an old house making noise. Back in the living room, I tried to distract myself with a movie. The TV light flickered and seemed almost comforting in the darkness. But then, I heard something that made me freeze. The living room door, which led to the hallway, slowly creaked open. My heart pounded in my chest. I waited in silence, listening intently. The door creaked again, but this time, it closed on its own. I slowly approached it and opened it cautiously. The hallway was empty. The house was eerily quiet again, but the feeling of dread lingered. I decided to check the locks on all the doors and windows. Everything seemed secure, and I tried to tell myself that the noises were just the house settling or perhaps small animals moving around in the attic. I stayed up the rest of the night, listening to the occasional creak and whisper of the house, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I was exhausted but relieved to see the sun rise. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the unsettling experience. I went up to the attic again in the daylight, hoping to find some explanation for the strange noises, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The days passed without any more incidents, and my parents returned home without any problems. I never mentioned the noises to them, not wanting to alarm them over nothing. To this day, I still think about that night, and the unsettling feeling of being alone in a house that seemed to have a mind of its own. Even though nothing dangerous happened, the eerie experience left me with a lingering sense of unease and a newfound respect for the unsettling quiet of an empty house. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when my roommates left for a concert, leaving me alone in our old apartment. I was looking forward to some solitude, catching up on reading, enjoying a late dinner, and just relaxing. Little did I know, the evening would turn into one of the most unnerving experiences of my life. The apartment was on the top floor of a vintage building with creaky floors and narrow hallways. It was the kind of place with character, and while it sometimes felt a bit spooky, I usually enjoyed the charm it brought. That night, after my roommates left, I settled into the living room with a good book. The gentle hum of the heater and the distant sounds of the city outside made for a comforting backdrop. Around 9 p.m., I decided to make some popcorn and watched a movie to unwind. As I was preparing the popcorn, I heard a faint knock on the apartment door. It was so quiet and unexpected that I almost didn't believe my ears. I went to the door and looked through the peephole, but no one was there. I opened the door cautiously, but the hallway was empty. I shrugged it off as a prank or a neighbor's mistake. Returning to the kitchen, I heard the knock again, this time louder and more insistent. My heart started to race. I went to the door again, peeking through the peephole and checking the hallway. Nothing. I closed the door and locked it, feeling a bit uneasy. I went back to the living room, trying to distract myself with the movie. Just as I was about to relax, I heard the knock again, this time coming from the window. I froze, my mind racing. The window was on the far side of the room, and the only thing outside was a sheer drop to the street below. I walked over and cautiously pulled aside the curtain. Outside, the window was perfectly clear. No one was there. I checked the locks and made sure everything was secure. I returned to my movie, trying to shake off the feeling of paranoia creeping in. The knocking stopped, and I thought maybe it was just the wind or some other harmless explanation. I was about to relax when I heard a different sound, a faint scratching noise coming from the ceiling. The noise was rhythmic and persistent, like something or someone was moving around up there. My pulse quickened. I knew the building had a roof access, but it was locked, and no one else had access to it. I grabbed a flashlight and went up to the attic, trying to convince myself it was just rodents or the building settling. The attic was dark and cluttered with old furniture and boxes. I shone the flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of place. The scratching noise had stopped. I felt silly for being so anxious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went back downstairs, trying to calm myself. As I reached the living room, I noticed that the lights in the apartment seemed dimmer, and there was an odd chill in the air. I checked all the windows and doors again, but everything was secure. Just as I was about to sit down, I heard a loud bang from the kitchen. I rushed in, but nothing was amiss, just the empty popcorn bowl on the counter. I tried to steady my nerves, reminding myself that the apartment was old and creaky, and noises could easily be explained away. Finally, I settled back into the living room, keeping all the lights on and the doors locked. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was off. The knocking and scratching remained unexplained. When my roommates returned, I recounted the night's events. They were skeptical but assured me it was probably just the old building making noise. We checked the attic again together, but there was nothing unusual. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. The knocking and scratching remain a mystery, and while nothing bad happened to me, the feeling of being watched and the unexplained noises still haunt me. I've learned to accept that some experiences defy explanation, and sometimes, the scariest thing is not knowing what's lurking just beyond the edge of our understanding. A few months ago, I experienced something that completely shifted my perspective on what's truly frightening. I was house-sitting for a friend who lived in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. It was a beautiful place, but with its creaky floors and labyrinthine layout, it had a way of making the most mundane things feel unsettling. The day started off uneventfully. I spent my time catching up on reading and enjoying the solitude. As evening approached, I decided to make some dinner. The house was quiet, with only the sound of the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Everything seemed perfectly normal until the power went out. I was in the kitchen when it happened. The lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I wasn't overly concerned. It was a common occurrence in this old house, and I had a flashlight handy. I rummaged through a drawer for some candles and matches, managing to get a few lit to provide some semblance of light. After settling down with a book by candlelight, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the floor above, where the bedrooms were located. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sound persisted and seemed to follow a deliberate pattern. It was almost as if someone was tapping on the floorboards with a purpose. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my book, but the tapping grew louder and more insistent. It was driving me crazy, so I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and headed up the staircase. The old wood creaked under my feet, adding to the eerie ambience. I reached the top floor, where the tapping was now unmistakable. It seemed to come from the room at the end of the hall, the master bedroom. I approached the door and hesitated before pushing it open. The flashlight beam revealed an empty room with a large, antique bed and a few pieces of old furniture covered in dust sheets. I walked around, looking for any source of the noise, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The tapping had stopped as soon as I entered the room. I checked under the bed, in the closet, and behind the curtains, but everything was as it should be. I shrugged it off and returned downstairs. Back in the living room, I tried to get comfortable again, but the sense of unease lingered. I put on some music, hoping to drown out any further disturbances. The power was still out, so I was relying on candles and the faint glow of my flashlight. Hours later, just as I was about to head to bed, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder and more erratic, almost like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just the house settling or maybe even a critter in the walls. I decided to go back upstairs and check again. As I climbed the stairs, the tapping grew even louder. It was now accompanied by a low, groaning sound, which made my skin crawl. I reached the top floor and noticed that the door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar. I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight around. The room was still empty, but then I noticed something odd. The dust sheets on the furniture seemed to be disturbed, and the bed had a large indentation in the center, as if someone had recently sat down. I backed away slowly, feeling a cold sweat forming on my forehead. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. I took a deep breath and decided to call my friend, hoping they might provide some insight into these strange occurrences. As soon as I picked up the phone, the power was restored, and the house was flooded with light. The tapping and groaning sounds stopped instantly. My friend answered the phone and reassured me that there was nothing unusual about the house. They suggested that it might just be the old pipes or some loose floorboards. I felt a bit foolish, but their explanation did little to calm my nerves. That night, I stayed awake in the living room, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness. I checked the house thoroughly, but everything seemed in order. I didn't sleep much, and the following day I was more than ready to leave. I never did find out what caused the tapping or the strange noises. My friend assured me it was just the quirks of an old house, but the experience left me with a lingering sense of unease. I learned that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't explain, and the old Victorian house had more than its fair share of secrets. It was a chilly evening in late autumn when I found myself home alone for the first time. My family had gone out for a weekend trip, leaving me in charge of the house. I was excited about the solitude, eager to enjoy some peace and quiet. The house was a cozy, two-story place with large windows and a big backyard, surrounded by dense woods. The first night went by uneventfully. I settled in with a movie marathon and took comfort in the warmth of the fireplace. As midnight approached, I turned off the TV and headed to bed, locking the doors behind me. I was deep in sleep when I was jolted awake by a loud crash downstairs. My heart raced as I lay in bed, straining to hear any other sounds. I was alone in the house, and the thought of an intruder made me freeze. I picked up my phone, ready to call the police, but I hesitated, wondering if I was overreacting. The house was eerily quiet now, and the crash could have been a book falling off a shelf or something similar. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly crept downstairs. The house seemed unusually cold as I descended the stairs. The crash had come from the living room, and as I approached, I noticed the front door was ajar. I didn't remember leaving it open, which only heightened my anxiety. I carefully pushed the door closed, making sure it was secure. The living room was in disarray. A lamp had fallen over, its shade twisted at an odd angle. I scanned the room with my flashlight, finding nothing else out of place. My nerves were on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked all the windows and doors, ensuring they were locked. Everything seemed fine. Just as I was about to head back upstairs, I heard a faint sound from the basement, a low, rhythmic thumping. My pulse quickened, and I considered calling my parents, but I didn't want to worry them over nothing. I steeled myself and decided to check it out. The basement door was in the kitchen, and it creaked loudly as I opened it. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, and the darkness seemed to swallow the space below. I turned on the basement light and slowly descended, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, just as I remembered from when we had last cleaned it. The thumping continued, seeming to come from a storage room at the back. I approached the room cautiously, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. When I opened the door, the thumping stopped abruptly. I hesitated, my breath visible in the chilly air. The room was full of old household items and unused equipment. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I noticed a small, wooden box on a high shelf. The box wasn't there before, and it looked oddly out of place. I reached for the box, and as soon as I touched it, a loud bang came from the main floor. I jumped and nearly dropped the box, my heart racing. I quickly returned the box to the shelf and hurried back upstairs, looking over my shoulder. Back in the living room, I found the front door wide open again. I locked it firmly and checked every other door and window. The house was still, and the eerie feeling of being watched persisted. My nerves were frayed, and I decided it was best to stay in my room until morning. I finally managed to sleep, though fitfully. When my family returned the next day, I told them about the strange occurrences. They listened with concern but dismissed it as an overactive imagination and minor disturbances typical of an old house. Later, I did some research and found out that the house had a history of unsettling incidents. The previous owner had experienced similar disturbances, though nothing ever seemed to be stolen or damaged. It turned out that the house had been built on land with a long history of local folklore and ghost stories. To this day, I still remember that night vividly. The open door, the thumping in the basement, and the feeling of being watched linger in my mind. Though nothing bad happened, the experience was enough to make me wary of staying home alone again. The house remains a place where strange things happen, and sometimes, it's better to let some mysteries remain unsolved.